Hello, and welcome to Overcoming Common Scaling Dysfunctions. My name is Jenny Stuart. I'm the Vice President of Consulting at Construx Software, and I've worked with organizations doing large projects for as long as I've been at Construx. So from the days before Agile, as well as many teams over the last 15 years or more, Scrum or other combinations of Agile development. This talk isn't really aimed at huge scale. So if you're talking about 1,000 people working together on a single product, I actually believe those are one of the times it starts to make a lot of sense to look at a scaling framework, for example, SAFe, that answers a lot of questions that you have when you're quite that huge. This is really more for people at, say, the 25 to 50 team, 25 to 500 team size, or for people who already have a scaling framework in place or have scaled processes in place, but are looking for a few tips, tricks, or practices to help them address some of the challenges they're seeing. So I hope that sets a little bit of context for what this talk is intended for and trying to do. I've worked with teams who think that scale is 5 Scrum teams working together. I've also worked with teams where 25 or 50 are working together. I think the largest team I ever saw was about 5,000 people working together on a single product. So scale, your version of scale can look significantly different. Why are we having this conversation? Well, if you joined Steve this morning, he certainly talked about a lot of the dynamics that size have on projects. And if you didn't, I would recommend seeing that archived session or watching his Understanding Software Projects. He goes into some great dynamics about what you should expect as teams, as projects and groups grow in size and scale. Fundamentally, large projects are just much harder. We've got more dependencies across all of those teams that we need to deal with. We typically have a larger set of stakeholders or users or customers, and we need to synthesize and understand all those needs, leading us then to need to develop, prioritize, and coordinate hundreds or thousands of product backlog items across all of our teams. We need to figure out how to address the design activities across all of those teams and what kind of guidance we need to give them. We need to integrate that work across multiple teams so that we can actually see a product taking shape as we build it. We need to sustain high quality throughout that and so much more. So fundamentally, we know large projects are hard. All we have to do is look at some of the data about project success and failure to know that at small sizes, we can be quite successful, and at very large sizes, we're lucky just to be able to finish a project at all. There are so many risks to it. Another way of thinking about it is that the activities that occur on a project actually change as the project sizes increase. So if we're looking at very small and small projects, a huge percentage of the work on those projects is construction activities. But as you start to get even into sort of mid-size projects, as we see here, the other activities really start to come into play in a nonlinear fashion. So there's much more requirements work, integration work, architecture work, system testing work that occurs as projects get larger and larger and larger. So I definitely think of Scrum or Kanban at the team level as a wonderful starting point, but those really aren't enough alone to address scale. We need to be talking about other things, other practices, other roles, other techniques, other things that help make sure that we're bringing everything together in an effective way that supports predictable delivery. So a few of the dysfunctions I've seen along the way. Number one is building on a weak foundation. Number two is being very focused on what the individual teams are and not focused enough on that whole big picture and making sure we can see that taking shape. Missing or weak quality focus, not building that in as we go and paying some pretty severe penalties towards the end. Lack of decision makers, or jokingly I call it here, too many cooks in the kitchen. But ultimately we need to have some decision makers, especially at large scale, to make sure we're all aligned and going the same direction. Yanni gone wild, so you ain't gonna need it. There's a lot of debate in the industry about Yanni versus BDUF, but I want to talk a little bit more about intentional design or thoughtful design. And then death by dependencies. So let's go into all of these a little bit more. Building on a weak foundation, I have seen, I was in a 1,000-person organization once whose direction of Agile to their teams was simply go Agile. So when we went in and started working and talking with those teams and asking them what Agile meant to them and what they were doing, they said, well, Agile means we hold daily stand-ups and we don't document. Now you can imagine that's a little problematic if you're trying to actually do a large-scale project with those people. Or I was in another organization where people, well, actually many organizations, I've been in many organizations, especially doing Scrum, where people are doing Scrum, but we're doing some things that really undermine the ability of Scrum to be predictable, valuable, and deliver successfully. Like we do Scrum, but we don't have a product owner. So the teams are doing the best they can with what they have, but they don't have enough guidance or direction to really be successful. Or we're doing Scrum, but we have stopped doing sprint retrospectives, and so nobody sees what we're building until we're 6 months into it, and then we finally get feedback and learn that, oops, that wasn't really what we needed and wanted to build. So the first step to scale is to actually understand what Agile is in your organization. And understand why you're doing Agile. So are we doing Agile because we want faster time to market, or we want higher quality? What are we trying to do? And then what is Agile in our organization so that everybody is rowing in the same direction? Many of the teams I work with, Scrum is the base. It's what most of the teams do. So just saying that, we do Scrum most of the time, and our Scrum includes user stories with story point estimation. We use velocity, and we do continuous integration. And perhaps if you're lucky enough, you're doing test-driven development as well. And we use Kanban in these particular situations for maybe our production support teams, or our automation teams, where we want them to be able to be more responsive. But making sure you've got a good understanding of what Agile means in your organization so that you can have a high fidelity adoption of whatever your selected Agile approach is. Whether it's Scrum or whether it's Kanban, making sure that the individual teams work effectively. If I don't have the good building blocks in place of each individual team being able to deliver successfully, predictably, high quality software, how can I ever have a project with 50 of these teams being able to be successful? I had an organization I was in once who said, well, Scrum's been really problematic for us, so we think we're going to adopt the Scale Agile framework. Which is a little crazy because, again, all the scaling frameworks are built on this idea of a high fidelity adoption at the individual team level. So making sure that we've got a solid, strong foundation is a key starting point for actually making anything work at scale. Another thing I've seen a lot of organizations do is focus too much on what the individual teams are doing and not enough on the whole. I worked with an organization once. They told me they were doing Scrum, and then I went in and started talking to them about how their projects ran, and they said, well, we start a project. Our projects are usually 7 to 9 months long, and the first thing that happens is each of the teams checks out from main their own source code, and they work on it for 5 to 7 months before they check it back in. I told them they were doing waterfall, not actually Scrum, and yes, that's a little extreme. But I've been in lots and lots of organizations where the individual teams are very busy. You can see the bits and pieces and the parts they're working on, but your ability to actually see the product being built isn't there. I was in an organization once that had 18 Scrum teams. They were about halfway through a year-long project. They had about 300 some odd epics they had planned to deliver. And at the time that I first visited with them, they had about 10 complete. So they had lots of work that was being done, but you really couldn't actually see the product coming together at all. And they really were on track. Well, I ended up telling them they were absolutely had no chance of actually delivering that project in the time frame that they expected. And we needed to get some rationality around what they were delivering and how they were going to deliver it. but I want to actually see my product being built, not just the individual bits and pieces that the teams are doing. So some solutions to this. The first one is a shared cadence. All of the scaling frameworks all have this idea now of a shared cadence, and typically that cadence is about 2 weeks long. But being able to have a moment in time on a regular basis where we can look at the work across all of the teams and see whether or not that product's being built. And the example we have here has one team that's on a longer rhythm. It's on a 4-week rhythm, not a 2-week rhythm. And it's important to recognize that while teams 1, 2, and 3 are in 2-week sprints, the product is actually in a 4-week sprint. It's the longest sprint cadence of the longest team. Making sure that we integrate our code very often. So don't be those 7 teams that I worked with that go for 6 months or 7 months. Really what you'd like to do is every single day you have a working product integrated across all of those teams. If you work on a legacy system, that might be challenging. You might not even be able to do it every single sprint. But in those particular cases, then you probably want to bring in some ideas from something like SAFe that has a program increment, or I had an organization I worked with that adopted it and called it a cycle. So every 8 to 12 weeks, they were able to make sure they had a fully integrated, stable, working product, including all of the hardening they did. Now that's an awfully long time for a fully integrated working product. So we were working with them to help them move that so that they were able to have one at the end of every single sprint. And eventually, actually, over time, the goal would be to making sure they had it every single day. So converging that code, integrating it as often as you possibly can to make sure that you can really see that product. The next thing many teams will do is have what's called maybe a combined sprint review or a product review or a joint review. This is looking at the work across all of the teams coming together so we can get feedback from the workflow or the end-to-end scenarios or use cases that the teams are all helping to deliver. And it usually occurs on a pretty regular basis. Some of the scaling frameworks actually replace individual sprint reviews with this whole product review, and it is the capstone at the end of the sprint to look at what we've done together. Some teams actually supplement it. So if you look at SAFe, teams have their individual sprint reviews, and in the sprint N+1, the next sprint after the current sprint has completed, there is an integrated, they call it a system demo, an integrated demo across all of the teams. Occasionally, I've worked with teams who begin with just a monthly review. So the individual Scrum teams are doing sprint reviews, or Agile teams are doing reviews every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, and once a month there's a larger, broader review. I've been in a few organizations where anytime all of the user stories across 5, 6, 10 teams are all completed, an epic or a feature is then demoed to the larger stakeholders. My personal preference is that we actually do this on a regular rhythm. Preferably, if you have 2-week sprints, you're doing a product review every 2 weeks as well, in the spirit of I want feedback sooner, I want to course correct sooner, I want to know if we're wrong so that we can do something about it sooner. The other thing that combined sprint reviews really help is separating the idea of it's all about the team and helping them recognize it's about what the team does that contributes to the overall product. And we want to make sure people, especially stakeholders, who may not want to go see 15 teams or 25 teams work, who are really interested in the work aggregated across all of those teams, have a chance to see that occurring. Another thing that we want to do is what's called a product or system level retrospective. So the individual team retrospectives are invaluable and should never go away. But when you're at scale, often many of the big challenges that undermine the effectiveness for the teams are out of the control of any one single team. They're part of the overall system, and they need to be identified and managed and addressed by often leadership to help deal with that. So let's bring together a representative from every team maybe the Scrum Master, or maybe just the person who can best represent the challenge the team is facing that's outside their span of control. I've been in organizations where conversations about the build or conversations about the metrics disincentivizing people came up in these kind of retrospectives. And what we're looking for is some sort of system-wide change that we need to make. Again, it's really preferable that this is held every single sprint, but I have worked in a few organizations who are just bringing it into place, and they start by doing it monthly. Monthly is at least better than not doing it at all. The other thing I really recommend for these kind of retrospectives is use a really simple Kanban board as a way to show people what has been done to improve the system, what you're currently working to improve the system, and the backlog of ideas that have been coming up from the teams and what those priorities are. Dysfunction number 3, weak or missing quality focus. I was in an organization 3 or 4 years ago now who was actually interested in moving to Scrum. And as we got into talking about what was happening, turns out they were in what I have for a long time called infinite defect mode, where when you find and fix a defect, you inject one or more new defects. So I told them that it was a little too late for anything to solve them at that point. You basically had to watch the defect trend data and wait for it to tip the other direction. But that with a good high fidelity implementation of Scrum on their teams, we can certainly set them up so that it didn't happen to them in the future. I have also worked with a number of teams where they have a pretty high penalty or tax for their releases. I had an organization I was working with once that was trying to get their release cycle down, moving closer to continuous deployment. And they had just started doing quarterly releases, and what they found was there was so much technical debt and so much of a missing focus on quality that in their quarterly cycle, they actually spent 1 month of it just doing hardening. So we really want to be building things in as we go, not paying the penalty in this project for not having a good quality focus, and certainly not paying the penalty in project after project for our lack of focus on quality. I really think of quality as the enabler for rapid delivery, and it's a huge focus and investment organizations often do not spend enough time on, do not invest in enough, to their detriment. And what I really want to do is I want to stabilize predictability. I want to make sure that we are finding and fixing defects as soon as we're injecting them. Steve McConnell said all good software development life cycles put defect detection activities as possible to defect injection activities. And I want to avoid having things like the infinite defect mode at the end where we basically don't know when we can get things done. And instead, I want to know I've got high quality working software. Really, the goal for me is to help organizations move to the point where we have a potentially shippable product as frequently as we possibly can, preferably at least every single sprint. So, of course, we need good technical practices here. We need things like automated unit testing. Preferably, if I can get the organization to do it, I'd like that to be test-driven development unit testing, where we write the test cases before we even write the code. We need automated functional or system testing to make sure the end-to-end flow works. And again, preferably that's done through business logic or microservices or APIs or hooks and stubs that we put in so that most of that can be done more at the business logic level, and only a small percentage of it is done at the UI level, where the test cases are often fairly brittle and pretty hard to maintain. And then many organizations use the idea of static code analysis, and usually static code analysis that actually gates your check-ins. So, for example, if your automated unit test falls below a certain level, you're unable to check in, or if the coverage, cyclomatic complexity of a particular module is too high, you're not able to check in. One really common thing that organizations need at large scale is the idea of what's our minimum standard definition of done, sometimes called a gold standard DoD. What's the smallest, what's the highest quality bar that every single team is capable of completing that individual teams can build upon, but they can't take anything out of. A real key to this is to get representatives from the teams together to build it. I've seen places where the gold standard definition of done is basically handed down from on high, and it's a, gee, we wish you could do this, not an, we can actually do this. The other thing I use the gold standard definition of done for is it becomes a great way to do some analysis between what can we do today and what would we need to have in our definition of done to truly have potentially shippable product at least the end of every single sprint. And that becomes a process improvement checklist that we can work our way through and becomes basically guidance on where we need to be investing more in building infrastructure, automation, other things that will support producing a higher quality product as we go. Some groups, this is one of those, you may need this solution. If you do, you do. If you do, it's kind of a bummer. If you've got a large legacy system or you have a 50, 100, 200 teams building together, each individual Agile team does need to be doing quality work. It needs to be ensuring that it's the work that it's doing, the stories and epics that it's completing, actually work and work within the overall product. But when you're very large or you have a legacy system, sometimes it's unreasonable to expect them to actually be able to test that everything else works. And it's certainly unreasonable to expect that a single team can test that the work of 5 teams being integrated together produces the end-to-end workflow expected for the organization. So it's not uncommon to need a parallel test team or a system test team or some other team that's really looking at the end-to-end workflow. I think it's incredibly important to make sure that people recognize that this does not mean the Agile teams no longer do testing. That's not the message that we're trying to send at all. It's incredibly important they continue to do the testing they can do and are capable of doing it. This team is often a team that has, say, specialists. So this team may have, if you have chaos engineers or penetration testers, that skill set is often pretty rare and very hard for the other teams to do. It's also the team that does testing that is too expensive, too difficult, or impossible for the individual teams to do because they only see one part of the overall puzzle, not the whole big puzzle that we're building. We need to make sure that we handle technical debt. There will always be technical debt. I counsel people all the time to make sure that that actually gets captured and put into your product backlog. I also tell people it's incredibly useful to include why addressing that technical debt is actually valuable to the organization. So I might be very interested in addressing technical debt if you tell me that if we fix the debt in a particular module now, that next feature or epic I'm interested in can probably be done twice as fast. That makes that debt much more interesting and is going to increase its likelihood of being high in the backlog. We need to determine how you're going to approach deciding to deal with the work. Are you going to just allocate time? Some people will allocate a % amount of every single release or project to technical debt. Are we going to estimate it and then treat it as a case-by-case basis? So again, are we going to allocate a sprint on a regular cadence? If you look at the Scaled Agile framework, it's now called an IP sprint, an innovation and planning sprint. But initially it was called a HIP sprint, a hardening innovation and planning sprint. And so they were basically in there allocating a sprint for addressing defects that had accumulated through that program increment, and often you'd see people doing some amount of technical debt retirement then. Are we going to do it product backlog item by product backlog item? A really common thing from my experience is people allocating a certain % and then turning to the technical folks, maybe a chief architect or a technical lead, to say, what items do you want to put into this bucket for being addressed in this particular project? Too many cooks in the kitchen. Are we all going in the same direction? I was in a team once that had 3,000 people working together, all a set of individual Scrum teams. Every Scrum team had a product owner. They had been given a pretty high-level vision. It was basically one of those build the world's best X, whatever their industry was. And so they were 3 years into a 2-year project with no end in sight because everybody had their own ideas of what needed to be built into this product. And nobody had the ability to say no to something because everything, of course, would be part of building the world's best X. How can you possibly say no to that kind of thing? I was also in another organization that had 7 Scrum teams. They had 7 product owners. They also had this concept of feature owners, since they had more features and people who wanted to shepherd features through than they had product owners. And in talking with senior leadership about what was happening, what the priorities were, and how those priorities were progressing through the project effort, come to find out the most important work from the user community's perspective was owned by a feature owner, but that feature owner didn't actually have any one team. And so they had to beg and borrow spare cycles from the product owners, and the product owners weren't interested in that work. They had their own agenda, they had their own priorities, and they had no interest in giving some time away to something they didn't see as particularly important. So we want to make sure that we're all going in the same direction. Everybody's aligned. We have a reasonably good understanding of the direction we're going and what constitutes success to get there. So a really important thing you'll see in both those cases that I mentioned, they're missing this idea of an ultimate decision maker. So at scale, there is typically something usually called a chief product owner, the ultimate product owner across all of the product owners, the ultimate decision maker about this capability is more important than that capability, or this feature is more important than that feature, and making sure everybody else is aligned and marching in the same direction. Product owners typically report, quote, into that person. It may not be organizationally reporting, but conceptual virtual reporting. And that group is often called the Product Owner Council, with the chief product owner really being a decision leader decides. I will hear your input, I will listen to you, but ultimately it is my job to make the right trade-off calls across all the work we're doing so our product provides the best value in the business area across the board. We also need to look at how the backlog is being managed. Almost inevitably, what I see nowadays is if you have a single product, you have a single product backlog. Now, because this product backlog might have thousands or thousands and thousands of items, there's the ability to assign items to teams so that individual teams can just look at their little piece of the world and see what they need to do. But as a chief product owner, I can see the big picture and I can see the whole, and I can make sure that we are making the right decisions in the product backlog to produce the highest value. And the Product Owner Council is usually working a little bit ahead of the Scrum teams. So if you look at Scrum teams, the general guidance is that they have about 1.5 to 2 sprints worth of fully refined, ready to work product backlog items ahead of them. And the Product Owner Council is generally looking 2 or 3 sprints ahead of that in terms of prioritization and perhaps looking at things like, how do we know this epic is going to have been successfully completed? What are maybe the epic level acceptance criteria? And then engaging appropriate technical people as needed to make sure things like dependencies are appropriately accounted for, and how that work is being sequenced and then fed into the pipeline of the individual Scrum teams. So they are typically meet about once or twice per week. Your mileage may be more or less, but you meet as often as you need to make sure that you're having all those coordination decisions, prioritization decisions, and ensuring that the product owners all understand how perhaps they're going to need to work together with their teams to sequence a particular epic to get that delivered across 3, 4, 5 different Scrum teams. One of my absolute favorite things to do when I have a bunch of Agile teams, maybe Scrum teams, maybe Kanban teams, maybe a mix of both, is to have a program level Kanban board that shows how work is flowing across all of those teams. So perhaps I've got epics that are flowing in. We're making sure we fully understand those. We understand the impact it's going to have on the teams. We understand what kind of dependencies are going to exist. We've identified anything that's a big technical risk and maybe prototyped that out so we're comfortable that we can go. That then gets decomposed into epics or stories that actually feed the individual Scrum teams. That then comes back together, and we've got a team that does chaos testing and security testing and load testing. And then finally, we document and dot any I's and cross any last T's for the end-to-end documentation that we need, make sure that all looks right, building on what the Scrum teams did, of course, and then it's finally done. So this is a wonderful place where Kanban can help provide some high-level visibility across all of the teams and help you back away from the details and really see the big picture. Dysfunction number 5 is you ain't gonna need it gone wild. I had a group I was working with, actually the first agile teams I ever worked with back in 2003, started as just one Scrum team, eventually turned into 9 Scrum teams building internal product together. They were about 1 year into it when they realized that some of the decisions they'd made up front, or actually realized they hadn't made some important decisions up front that now come to bite them pretty badly, and that the current design that they had in place just wasn't going to support some of the features and some of the performance elements of those features that they needed. They actually stood up a whole Scrum team that spent a year refactoring and re-architecting and adding some things into the system to support it. So, well, I'm not a fan of big design up front, where we're going to spend 3 months, 6 months trying to get the design 100% right up front, because we all know that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Even if you have a good plan, you're going to learn as you go and you're going to revise the plan. I do think that there's a certain amount of intentional design. If I have 1,000 people, I want at least some of the paradigms, patterns, understood and communicated and shared with people before I send them off to go build a bunch of stuff that might not integrate together. So are we going to do design by contract? Are we doing microservices? Give me some of the big picture items. I had a business intelligence team I worked with once, who got very concerned when we started talking about the idea of vertical slicing and delivering their reports incrementally based on what report was most important and what value was there. Historically, they'd always done it more in horizontal slices. So they had started with, we build the entire database layer, then we build the ETL, then we put the reports on top of that. And we were talking about the fact that typically they ended up refactoring a whole bunch of the ETL and the database once they put the reports on top of it. And we said, okay, well, so there's a whole bunch of rework that's happening there, but you've got some valid concerns about making sure that you understand the database. Do you actually have to build the database to understand it? And they kind of stopped and they stared and they looked at me for a second. They said, well, no, we don't have to build it, but we do need a logical data model. And I said, okay, great. So let's have you build a logical data model. And then let's have you start vertically slicing on top of that. And they said, okay. And off they went. And now what they ended up with, because their definition of done included update data model, is by the time they were done with that project, for the first time ever, they actually had a data model that reflected the reality of what they'd built, rather than a data model that reflected what they thought they would build at the beginning of it. So it's always going to be a balance here. What risks exist? How many teams do you have? How do you make sure you have enough of a foundation at the start and as you go to make sure that you're going to not encounter a whole ton of rework down the road? You're not going to have teams that don't have enough guidance and aren't able to make the right kind of decisions so that the whole product is actually working together effectively. So how are you going to approach this? Who oversees the big picture? Some places will have a chief architect or a solutions architect. Sometimes those solution or chief architects will oversee a dedicated architecture team. I was working with a group once that had about 20 Scrum teams. They had a chief architect. That architect actually was overseeing a single team that was building some core microservices that all of the rest of the teams were building upon. So they both built it and they consulted and coached all of the teams who started to use those particular services. Or perhaps a virtual architecture team. And the idea of a virtual architecture team is it is a community of people across the entire product, often chaired by a single person, sometimes called chief architect, who's really looking at that product backlog. The product owner council is looking at that backlog for value delivery. The virtual architecture team's looking at that for things like what's risky. You can usually go through a product backlog and look at it and say, where do we think the big long poles in terms of risks are? And so the virtual architecture team would then inform the product owner council about that risks. And in a healthy organization, we're going to do a balance of value delivery and risk reduction informed by what this particular team tells us. This group might also lead prototyping efforts on things where we need to learn about a new technology or a new way of doing things. They're going to add in product backlog items that help to improve the architecture, and they're going to work with teams to diffuse and actually infuse maybe patterns or paradigms or new things that have been built by the team. So hopefully one of the things you hear me saying is I believe that architects should be very, very, very active with their teams. How are you going to handle it? If you look at things like SAFe, they have the idea of enabler epics, which includes architecture work. Is it going to be a small team of people that do the work? Is it a small team of people that then coach and guide other people? It's really hard to say, here's the one way you should do it. Rather, when I work with organizations, we sit down and we say, how is this going to be best handled here, and what do we need to do? So this one's pretty open-ended, but the real key is to have a conversation about it and not just assume it's going to happen. I've been in way too many organizations, especially if you're a little on the smaller side of scale, 5 teams, 6 teams, who just kind of assume it's going to happen naturally. In one team, no problem, right? As long as you have somebody who has the right kind of thinking and is able to communicate and lead the team, it's not a problem. In 2, well, that one person can probably be an influencer. By the time you're at 5, you need to actually be thinking about how do we want to handle it. And I'm not proposing that this is immensely rigid or significantly documentation oriented, but going back to our program Kanban board, perhaps there's a investigation stage, and that investigation includes both, does the business case for this make sense, and have we done any big picture design thinking and technical risk reduction necessary to make sure that we think we can be successful as we actually begin to build and implement this capability. So dysfunction number 6, death by dependencies. Sometimes these large projects can just feel like they're completely out of control and you have no good sense of how are we going to get all the individual moving parts pulled together in a way that allows us to see a capability or a feature being built and making sure that all the right bits and pieces are being done. Solution number 1, we want to use feature teams as much as we possibly can. A feature team being able to do work in all the areas of the product necessary to produce an end user visible piece of functionality. So they are able to work in the presentation layer, the application layer, the microservices layer, the data layer. As much as possible, you want to do this. Many of the organizations I work in, especially when they're quite large, you're not going to get 100% to feature teams, or it's going to take a little while. There might be some enabling at an architectural level necessary to move you towards feature teams. So again, we sit down and have a discussion about what's possible now, what's possible in the future, and how are we going to do this. But it wouldn't be uncommon to have a set of feature teams that build upon some common services or core components built by another team that's enabling a wide group. So definitely not one of those people who says it has to be 100% this way, but I do recommend you move this way as much as you possibly can and is reasonable at this time. Because The real reason to move to feature teams is it allows you to dissolve dependencies rather than manage dependencies. And if I can dissolve a dependency and just get rid of it and it's completely removed, I would much rather do that. So the next thing a lot of groups will do, especially large product development groups or groups where predictability is really important, or legacy systems, is this idea of product level planning. So let's get together. This might be at the start of an overall release that we're going to be working on for 3 months or 6 months. Or this might be, again, a la the SAFe idea, rolling kind of planning. So in SAFe, they have this idea of program increment planning, and a PI lasts from 8 to 12 weeks. And the start of every PI is something called big room planning, which is basically product level planning. They talk about the vision for what they're trying to do. They talk about the epics they want to deliver. They talk about the features that produce that epic. And then the teams then take those features and decompose those down into the work they're going to do sprint over sprint over sprint. So the right amount of planning necessary based on how complex of a problem you have. The larger number of teams, again, to that idea of the construction activity increases linear as project size increases, but other activities increase non-linearly, requirements work and planning work. A big part of the product level planning activities is requirements work and planning work. So this sets the stage. We have a reasonable plan of attack. I'm never going to assume that plan is perfect. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. So if I'm doing a rolling plan and we plan for the next 10 weeks, we're going to say, I have a good plan, but if things change, I'm going to change my plan. I value responding to change over blindly following a plan off a cliff. But especially at scale, it's really helpful to have a reasonable plan of attack before you start executing, because you're bringing together, say, 25 or 50 teams. That's a lot of coordination and integration. And I want to make sure we're all going in the same direction and we have a good understanding of how we're going to get there. I want to make sure we actively manage the backlog. All of the tools all have the idea of dependency linking. So I can say this needs to go before that. A lot of times in that product level planning activity, one of the things people will produce is a dependency map. So you'll have the teams on one side, you'll have the sprints on the other side, and then you'll have a visual indicator of, the work from team A finished, we think is going to finish in sprint 2. That feeds team B in sprint 3, which feeds team F in sprint 4, which feeds team K in sprint 6. And so a understanding of how maybe an epic or a feature needs to thread across a bunch of teams. And then if something happens and the first team doesn't deliver in sprint 2, we can adjust and understand what that's going to mean. And certainly I've been in a few organizations where they do an impact assessment or an impact analysis to get a good understanding of, if we do this, what all is going to be impacted by doing this. And last but not least is the idea of a Scrum of Scrums meeting. In 2003, when I was working with that first team that had 9 different Scrum teams, this was how we scaled. There was the loose idea of a chief product owner, but primarily they leaned solely on Scrum of Scrums, and that we have learned so much more about what it takes to scale. I don't think we know everything. The fact that we have multiple competing scaling frameworks out there, there's LESS, there's Nexus, there's SAFe, there's Scrum at Scale. There's all sorts of ideas. That tells me we still have more to learn, but we certainly know Scrum of Scrums, good practice, alone, not enough to support scaling, especially large level scaling. But a Scrum of Scrums is a regular meeting, typically 1 to 3 times a week, with a representative from each team, and they're really doing coordination and check-in. We're talking about, what have I done since we last met? What am I about to do? What do I need from you? What am I potentially going to do that's going to impact you? So a touchstone coordination point between the teams. I think of this as dependency management. A lot of the other things that we were talking about is either trying to proactively understand my dependencies so they're easier to manage, or for feature teams, actually trying to dissolve that dependency so I just don't even have to deal with it. So in summary, scaling works best with high fidelity adoption at the individual team level. Build on a weak foundation, the whole thing's going to be really hard to manage. Try your level best to structure the team so that they actually own the responsibility of producing working software, and they have all the skills on that team necessary to produce working software. And when I say working software, I mean it is built, it is unit tested, it is functional tested, and it has all the necessary documentation, like if there's initial release notes or those sorts of things that's actually produced. So structure the team so they have what they need so that they can have as high quality of a working deliverable as possible. Recognize at scale, Scrum or Kanban at the team level is just not going to be enough. You're going to need some additional roles and responsibilities. Whether you call it a chief product owner or not, I need an ultimate decision maker who's going to make the prioritization, big picture prioritization calls. I want some way of seeing my whole product taking shape, not just the bits and pieces. So a combined sprint review of some kind. I really want a system level retrospective. I've found in pretty much every organization I've been in, yes, the individual agile teams have things they need to do to be better. But optimizing them still isn't actually going to give you the best value delivery you can possibly have. There's always been system level issues that really get in the way of those teams being able to deliver effectively. So I believe in the best of both worlds. Let's fix both. Some form of appropriate release planning. The closer and closer you get to continuous deployment, the more you can actually move to something like Kanban, where it's really just a question of what's the next thing we need to do. The more you're on the large legacy system, the more some form of release planning is going to be important to you. And if you live in a world that values predictability, you're going to need to do some more upfront planning because we need to build a rational plan of attack. Scrum of Scrums to help us coordinate those dependencies as we go, some way of minding and managing and helping assure the architecture is working across all of those teams. And then a focus. You may not be there today. I work with most of the organizations I work with aren't doing greenfield development. They're really doing legacy development. And they're not at a point today where they can build a releasable product each and every sprint. But I want them to get there, and that becomes a goal and objective. And I actually find the big cry around DevOps to be a wonderful thing to hook my sled to. So when I'm in organizations and DevOps is the way to go, well, if you can't actually produce releasable software every sprint, how do you think you're actually going to get to this idea of we deploy as soon as something is particularly done? So that can be a wonderful way for an organization to rally around it and start to do investments. It is investments. You're going to need to invest in increases in unit testing, increases in automated functional testing, probably build processes, probably deployment processes, maybe environment processes. There's all sorts of stuff here. And if you are interested, we do have some additional white papers on the topics of succeeding with geographically distributed Scrum, retrofitting legacy systems with unit tests, and other white papers that kind of supplement the materials that we've talked about here today. So I hope you found at least one practice or tip or technique that you can use to help improve how you're scaling. So with that, let's turn to some questions. Have you seen Scrum or other lean agile approaches successfully applied to implementing COTS ERP? If so, what methodology, project lifecycle adaptations may be required? Yes, absolutely. If you'd asked me 10 years ago on the COTS side of the world or ERP applications, I would have said, not many people are doing it. 5 years ago, there's a lot of uptake. Now there's a lot being done. I wouldn't say there's anything required in terms of a life cycle adaptation. Really, if you think about, let's just use Scrum because Scrum's so widely and predominantly adopted, and I'd guess that's probably the first thing your organization would be thinking about. It is just a project management wrapper at the individual team level that has a deliverable at the end that we can inspect and adapt on. So that deliverable might be working software, or it might be a configuration. So the key really becomes getting a good backlog in place, learning how to decompose that backlog so at the end of 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you actually have something that's inspectable. But there's nothing fundamentally that needs to change. And I want to say all such a strong word, but most, I think most, if not all, of the practices that we've talked about here would be applicable in that kind of environment if you're talking about a COTS deployment at scale. There are so many flavors of agile scaling: safe, less, disciplined, agile. What are some good strategies to pick a methodology? Well, hard to answer that question really quickly in the time we have, so let me point you to something. We actually have a webinar I did called How to Choose an Agile Scaling Framework, and it gives a high-level summary of each of those frameworks, along with some of the criticisms, along with some of the places that we typically see them used most often. So that's a good resource for you. Our organization is growing. Can a new role of product manager in addition to existing product owners help? Hard to know. I think our contact information is available. Maybe email me and give me a little bit more details. In my experience, I like to think of product owner as a role. Product managers can often step into that role if they have the time. And if the organization gives them the time to commit to being a product owner, they make great product owners for feature teams or customer-facing teams. Many organizations, product managers are pretty busy doing externally focused things, customer visits, competitive analysis, road mapping, other things. And so they actually provide input to product owners and become a big stakeholder of Scrum teams. So we do have a white paper on staffing Scrum roles that would be helpful to you to look at, to talk a little bit more about the role of a product owner and what we usually see in terms of product managers taking on the product owner role or not. Any tips on moving to a product-wide end of sprint demo from individual cross-geo demos? So first question for me would be, are you going to do this as a supplemental demo or as a replacement demo? So have that conversation. Many times I see people start initially with supplemental. And so the question becomes, when do we want to hold that meeting? It's typically not held right when the sprint ends. So let's say your sprint ends on Tuesday. It's going to end on different times in Tuesday because the Bangalore team end and the US team end are going to be on different times. But perhaps you then have the combined sprint review that lasts for maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours at most, because you're really highlighting the work across all those teams, and it happens within the next 2 or 3 days. So that's going to delay the feedback loop a little bit into the teams. You're not going to be able to immediately make a change based on that feedback in the next sprint because the teams have already started. But at least my feedback loop is now 2 sprints, not 8 sprints or 12 sprints. We've been doing inspect and adapt meetings every PI. You mentioned retrospectives are typically held, system-wide retrospectives, I expect, are typically held after every sprint. Do you recommend we hold our inspect and adapt meetings that often? So inspect and adapt meetings are from the Scaled Agile framework. They occur at the end of every program increment, so that's 8 to 12 weeks, and they include everybody in the organization. This is a little bit of a beer and philosophy conversation. I have one perspective, and I typically like multi-beers. Other people will have other perspectives and like IPAs. I think that's too long to wait. So I would want a system level retrospective happening at least once a month. And it doesn't have to include everybody in the organization. It just includes representatives from the team. And then the question would be, does it still make sense to have that larger inspect and adapt meeting? Initially, I would probably do an and then reflect and see what we want to do and then change. We have a legacy system with lots of manual regression testing. It's possible today for us to produce working software at the end of every sprint. What do you recommend? It's a journey. I've definitely worked with organizations where it's a 3 or more year effort to get to the point where they can produce working software at the end of every sprint. But all journeys start with your first step. And so looking at your current definition of done or your quality bar at the team level, looking at the gaps, looking at what is typically the most painful things that happen in the hardening sprints or the things that typically are the long pole, and then incrementally adding automation or fixing build processes or adding infrastructure based on what you think is going to give you the biggest ROI. And that can be a wonderful thing if you were doing, say, inspect and adapt meetings. That would be a wonderful thing to start maybe adding in your inspect and adapt meeting is where do we need to be investing that infrastructure, and then making sure that gets into the product backlog in some way so it can be addressed. Doesn't the system test team or parallel test team undermine the responsibilities of the Scrum teams to produce high quality working software? It shouldn't if it's done well. So the big thing is, A, do you even need one? Perhaps you don't need one at all. The teams can do all the necessary load testing, stress testing, performance testing, security testing, end-to-end testing, and you're done. You don't need to do anything. So really you only put a team in place if you need it. And then you're thinking about what is the role and responsibility of this team. This may be somewhere you want to actually charter the team and say, this is the charter of this particular group, and make it very clear to people. The other thing I like to see these teams doing, so for example, if you have a team and one of the big things they do is performance testing, see if you can get them to build a small automated script that does minimal performance testing that can be added into the regular build process. And now it can be part of the Scrum teams to make sure that they are actually able to pass the performance smoke test before it goes to the team. So we might want to be using the idea of shift left. We want to shift our quality left. So what are things we can move out of this system test team into the individual Scrum teams so that they're able to produce higher quality as they go. I haven't talked a lot about geographically distributed organizations. Do all these techniques and practices still apply when you have multiple sites around the world? Yes. 10, 15 years ago, I'm actually probably more like 15 years ago now, I very rarely saw geographically distributed organizations. Now, if you're interested in this talk, you are likely to have at least one site, if not multiple sites around the world. And everything that I talk about here comes from working with organizations that are geographically distributed around the globe. All right. Well, thank you all for joining me today. Again, I hope there's at least one takeaway, a good nugget or kernel that you can use, if not more, to help you improve your large-scale adoption of Agile.